"You'll give me 5 sons and never work again," the giant cowboy told the Barefoot Waitress. The glass shattered against the wall 2 inches from Katie's head. She didn't flinch anymore. 3 years slinging drinks at the Dusty Rose Saloon had taught her that much. The drunk miner who threw it was already being dragged out by his collar, boots scraping across the wooden floor. She grabbed her tray and kept moving, bare feet silent on the worn boards. Her last pair of shoes had fallen apart 2 weeks ago. Her boss said he'd take the cost out of her pay. Katie stopped asking after that. "Coffee, black," a voice rumbled from the corner booth. Katie turned and nearly dropped her tray. The man sitting there barely fit in the seat. He had to be 6'7", maybe more, with shoulders that stretched his dusty coat tight across the back. His hat sat on the table, revealing dark hair touched with gray at the temples. But it was his eyes that stopped her, pale blue and fixed on her face with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "Coming right up," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. She poured the coffee with practiced hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. When she brought it to his table, he wrapped one massive hand around the cup, making it look like a child's toy. "You work here every night?" he asked. "Every night for 3 years," Katie said. "That'll be 5 cents. He put down a silver dollar. "Keep it." Katie stared at the coin. That was more than she made in a week. "I can't accept this." "You just did." He took a long drink of coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. "What's your name?" "Katie Walsh." "Jack Morrison." He set down his cup. "I own the Morrison Ranch, 40 miles north, 10,000 acres, 500 head of cattle, and a house with 12 rooms. Katie shifted her weight, confused by this strange conversation. "That's real nice for you, Mr. Morrison." "I came to town for one reason," Jack said, leaning forward. The lamplight caught the hard lines of his face, weathered by sun and wind. "I need a wife." The saloon noise faded to a dull roar in Katie's ears. She must have heard him wrong. "Excuse me?" "You heard me right." Jack Morrison stood, rising to his full, enormous height. "I built that ranch from nothing, and I got nobody to leave it to. I need sons." 5 of them. Katie took a step back, her bare foot finding a rough patch on the floor. "You're crazy." "I'm practical," Jack said, "and I'm offering you a deal. You marry me. Give me 5 sons, and you'll never work another day in your life. You'll have everything you need. Good food, warm clothes, a real bed, and a roof that doesn't leak." Katie's throat went dry. She looked down at her bare feet, at her threadbare dress, at her hands rough from years of hard work. Then she looked back at this giant stranger who'd just offered her a life she'd only dreamed about. "Why me?" she whispered. Jack Morrison picked up his hat and placed it on his head. "Because you didn't flinch when that glass almost hit you. Because you're still standing after 3 years in this place. Because I can see strength in you, Katie Walsh, and that's what I need in a mother for my sons." He pulled out a card and set it on the table next to the silver dollar. "Think about it. I'm staying at the hotel across the street for 3 days. After that, I'm heading back to my ranch. With or without you." Then he walked out, his spurs jingling softly with each step, leaving Katie standing in the middle of the saloon with her heart racing and her mind spinning with impossible possibilities. Katie couldn't sleep that night. She lay on the thin mattress in the cramped room she shared with 2 other waitresses, staring at the ceiling while her roommates snored. The silver dollar felt heavy in her pocket. She kept taking it out, feeling its weight, making sure it was real. Jack Morrison's offer played through her mind on an endless loop. 5 sons, never work again. It sounded like a fairy tale, the kind her mother used to tell her before the fever took her. But fairy tales weren't real, and men didn't just offer to marry strange waitresses out of nowhere. By dawn, Katie had made her decision. She would return the silver dollar, thank him politely, and forget this ever happened. It was too strange, too sudden, too good to be true. She got dressed in her only other outfit, a faded blue dress that had been patched so many times she'd lost count. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a thin woman of 23, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid and green eyes that looked older than her years. The hotel lobby smelled of tobacco and old wood. The clerk barely glanced at her bare feet before pointing toward the stairs. Room 12. Katie climbed the stairs slowly, rehearsing her polite refusal with each step. She raised her hand to knock, but the door opened before her knuckles touched wood. Jack Morrison stood there, freshly shaved, his hair still damp. He changed into clean clothes, a white shirt that somehow made him look even bigger. His pale blue eyes studied her face. "I came to return this," Katie said, holding out the silver dollar. "And to say thank you, but no thank you." Jack didn't take the coin. "Have breakfast with me first," then decide. "Mr. Morrison, I don't think—" "One meal, Katie." That's all I'm asking." Something in his voice made her lower her hand. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the smell of fresh bread coming from somewhere downstairs. Maybe it was the way he looked at her like she was worth something. "One meal," she agreed. The hotel restaurant was finer than anywhere Katie had ever eaten. White tablecloths, real china, windows that actually had glass in them. Jack ordered for both of them eggs and bacon and fresh bread with butter and jam. Katie tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some dignity, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a real meal. Jack watched her with a small smile, pushing the bread basket closer when it got low. "Tell me about yourself," he said when she finally slowed down. "Not much to tell. I grew up in Ohio. My parents died when I was 17. I worked my way west, thought I'd find something better. Ended up here instead. Any other family? A brother, maybe? He headed to California 5 years ago. Haven't heard from him since." Jack nodded slowly. "I lost my parents young, too. Spent my 20s working ranches for other men, saving every penny. Bought my first 100 acres when I was 30. Built it up from there." "Why didn't you marry before now?" Katie asked, then immediately regretted the bold question. But Jack didn't seem offended. "I was too busy building something worth having. Too focused on the work. Now I'm 42, and I look around that big house, and it's empty. What's the point of building something if there's nobody to pass it on to? So you need sons to inherit your ranch." "Yes," Jack said simply. "I won't lie to you about that. But I'm offering a fair trade. You give me children, and I'll give you security. A home. A place where you belong." Katie set down her fork, meeting his eyes directly. "You don't know anything about me. I could be a terrible person. I could be a thief or a liar." "Could be," Jack agreed, "but I don't think you are. I've met enough people in my life to trust my judgment, and my judgment says you're strong, honest, and tired of being alone." The last words hit harder than Katie expected. She was tired of being alone, tired of waking up in that cramped room, tired of dodging drunk men and broken glass, tired of going to bed hungry more nights than not. "This is insane," she said quietly. "Maybe," Jack said, "but is it more insane than spending the rest of your life in that saloon?" Katie looked out the window at the dusty street, at the life she'd been living for 3 years. Then she looked back at this enormous stranger who was offering her a way out. "If I agreed," she said slowly, "how would this work?" Jack leaned back in his chair. "We'd get married today at the courthouse. I'd buy you proper clothes and shoes. We'd leave tomorrow morning for the ranch. You'd have your own room until you're comfortable. I won't force anything on you, Katie, but I hope in time you'd come to see this arrangement as beneficial for both of us. And if I can't give you 5 sons, what if I can only have daughters, or no children at all? Then we deal with that when it comes," Jack said. "I'm not a monster. I'm just a man looking for a partner to build a life with." Katie twisted the silver dollar between her fingers. Her rational mind screamed that this was madness. But another part of her, the part that remembered her mother's stories about brave women who took chances and found happiness, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was her one shot at something better. "I have one condition," she heard herself say. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I want to learn to read properly. I only know a little and I want to do better." For the first time, Jack Morrison smiled fully, and it transformed his stern face into something almost gentle. "I have a library full of books waiting for you." Katie took a deep breath, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Then yes, do. I'll marry you." The courthouse ceremony took 15 minutes. The judge was a tired-looking man who'd clearly performed hundreds of marriages and treated this one no differently than any other. Katie wore the same patched blue dress. Jack stood beside her, towering over everyone in the room, his voice steady as he repeated his vows. When the judge pronounced them married, Jack placed a simple gold band on Katie's finger. She stared at it, unable to quite believe any of this was happening. Afterward, Jack took her to the general store. The owner's wife, a plump woman named Helen, took one look at Katie's bare feet and threadbare dress and clucked her tongue. "You poor dear," Helen said. "Let's get you fixed up properly." Katie stood frozen as Helen pulled out dresses, undergarments, stockings, boots, a warm coat, nightgowns, and a hairbrush. Jack stood by the counter, simply nodding whenever Helen asked if something was acceptable. "Try this on," Helen said, holding out a green dress that looked brand new. In the small changing room, Katie stripped off her old dress and touched the new fabric with trembling fingers. It was soft, well-made, without a single patch or tear. When she put it on, it actually fit her properly, not too tight or too loose. She stepped out, and Jack's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something that suggested approval. "That'll do," he said simply. "We'll take 3 more just like it, different colors." By the time they left the store, Katie had more possessions than she'd owned in her entire life. Jack loaded everything into a wagon that waited outside, already packed with supplies. "We leave at dawn," he said. "Get some rest tonight." He walked her back to the hotel and stopped outside the door to room 13, right next to his own room. "This is yours for tonight. Door locks from the inside." "I'll knock at 5 in the morning." Katie stepped inside and found a room 10 times nicer than anywhere she'd ever slept. A real bed with clean sheets, a wash basin with actual hot water, a window with curtains. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the gold ring on her finger. She was married. To a man she'd met yesterday. A man she was supposed to give 5 sons. The reality of what she'd agreed to crashed over her, and her hands started shaking. What had she done? But when she lay down on that soft bed and pulled the warm blankets over her, when she looked at her new clothes hanging in the wardrobe and her new boots sitting by the door, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Not yet. The knock came at exactly 5 in the morning. Katie had barely slept, her mind too busy racing through everything that had happened. She dressed in one of her new outfits, a brown dress with a white collar, and pulled on her first pair of real boots in months. Jack waited in the hallway, looking just as enormous as before. "Ready?" Katie nodded, now trusting her voice. The wagon ride out of town felt surreal in the pre-dawn darkness. Katie watched the buildings fade behind them as they headed north into open country. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Jack drove in silence for the first hour. Katie sat beside him, hyper-aware of his presence, of how his hands held the reins with easy confidence, of how he seemed completely comfortable with the quiet. "Tell me about the ranch," she finally said, needing to break the silence. "It's hard work," Jack said. "I have 10 men working for me. Good men, mostly. They live in the bunkhouse. The main house is separate, up on a hill. You can see for miles in every direction." "What will I do there?" "Whatever you want," Jack said. "The house needs a woman's touch. I have a cook, old Carlos, but he'd probably appreciate help. There's a garden that's been neglected. And the books I mentioned. You can read to your heart's content. And the men? How will they feel about you bringing home a wife?" "They'll treat you with respect, or they'll find work elsewhere," Jack said, his voice hard. "You're the lady of the house now, Katie. That means something." They stopped at midday to rest the horses. Jack unpacked food that Carlos had prepared, fresh bread and cheese and apples. They sat under a cottonwood tree, eating in companionable silence. "Can I ask you something?" Katie said. "Go ahead." "Why 5 sons specifically? Why not just children?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the open range. "My father had 5 sons. I watched my brothers die, one by one. Cholera took 2 when I was young. War took another. The last one got kicked by a horse 5 years ago. I'm all that's left of the Morrison line." "I'm sorry," Katie said softly. "Don't be sorry. Just understand why this matters to me. I want to rebuild what was lost. 5 sons to carry on the name, to work the land, to make sure everything I built doesn't disappear when I'm gone. And what if some of them are daughters?" Jack actually smiled at that. "Then I suppose I'll teach my daughters to work the land too. But I'm hoping for at least a few boys in the mix." They reached the ranch just as the sun was setting. Katie's first glimpse of her new home took her breath away. The house sat on top of a rolling hill, a sprawling 2-story structure made of wood and stone. Lights glowed in the windows, warm and welcoming. The bunkhouse sat 100 yards away, smoke rising from its chimney. Corrals and barns dotted the property, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. "Home," Jack said simply. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands nearly spanning her entire waist. As her feet touched the ground, the front door of the house opened, and an older man with gray hair and a weather-beaten face stepped out. "Boss?" the man said, then stopped when he saw Katie. His eyes widened. "Well, I'll be." "Carlos, this is my wife Katie," Jack said. "Katie, this is Carlos Martinez, best cook in 3 counties. Carlos recovered quickly, sweeping his hat off his head. "Mrs. Morrison, welcome home. I'll have supper ready in 20 minutes. Katie followed Jack into the house, her new boots echoing on the wooden floors. The interior was exactly as Jack had described. 12 rooms that seemed to stretch on forever compared to the tiny spaces Katie was used to. The furniture was simple but well made, everything neat and organized but somehow lifeless, like a house waiting for someone to bring it to life. Jack showed her through each room with few words. The parlor with its stone fireplace, the dining room with a table that could seat 12, the kitchen where Carlos was already working on supper, filling the air with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread. Then upstairs, where 5 bedrooms waited in a row. Jack stopped at the largest one at the end of the hall. "This is the master bedroom," he said. "It's yours." Katie stepped inside and found a room bigger than the entire apartment she'd shared back in town. A massive bed dominated one wall. A wardrobe stood open and empty, waiting to be filled. A window looked out over the rolling hills, now dark under the night sky. "Where will you sleep?" she asked. "The room next door," Jack said. "I meant what I said, Katie. I won't push you. This arrangement works on your timeline, not mine." Relief, and something else, something she couldn't quite name, washed through her. "Thank you. Supper's in 10 minutes. Wash up and come down whenever you're ready." He left her alone in the room. Katie stood by the window looking out at her new world, trying to process everything that had changed in just 2 days. Supper was surprisingly comfortable. Carlos had outdone himself with pot roast, vegetables, and bread so fresh it was still warm. He joined them at the table, clearly accustomed to eating with Jack. "So how'd you two meet?" Carlos asked, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "Jack walked into the saloon where I worked," Katie said. "Ordered coffee, then asked me to marry him." Carlos nearly choked on his food. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Jack confirmed, cutting his meat with steady hands. "Well, you always were a man who knew what he wanted," Carlos said, shaking his head with amusement. "Took you long enough to go looking for a wife, though. I've been telling you for years this place needed a woman." Over the next few weeks, Katie settled into a rhythm. She woke early, helped Carlos with breakfast, then spent her mornings exploring the ranch. The men working the cattle kept their distance at first, watching this new presence with wary curiosity. But Katie wasn't afraid of hard work. When she saw the neglected garden behind the house, she rolled up her sleeves and started clearing weeds. When Carlos's arthritis flared up, she took over cooking without being asked. When she found the library Jack had mentioned, she spent her evenings reading by lamplight, slowly improving her skills. Jack watched all of this with quiet approval. He worked from dawn to dusk, managing the ranch with the same intense focus he seemed to apply to everything. But every evening he came back to the house for supper, and they'd sit together in the parlor afterward. The weather. The books Katie was reading. But slowly, carefully, they began sharing more. Katie learned that Jack had built his first cabin with his own hands, that he'd survived a winter trapped in the mountains when he was 25, that he loved watching storms roll across the plains. Jack learned that Katie had once dreamed of being a teacher, that she missed her brother terribly, that she could sing, though she rarely did anymore. One night, 6 weeks after their arrival, Katie found Jack on the porch, staring out at the stars. She brought him coffee and sat beside him. "I've been thinking," she said carefully. Jack waited, his pale blue eyes patient. "I've been here almost 2 months now. You've kept every promise you made. I have a home, good food, time to read, and I'm not working myself to death anymore." "But?" Jack prompted. "But I haven't kept my end of the bargain," Katie said, feeling her cheeks warm. "You married me for a specific reason, and I've been hiding in my room every night like a scared child." Jack set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Katie, I told you this works on your timeline. I know what you said, but it's not fair to you. You've been nothing but patient and kind, and I keep waiting for some perfect moment that's never going to come. What are you saying?" Katie met his eyes, gathering her courage. "I'm saying that I'm ready if you are." Something shifted in Jack's expression, a crack in his carefully controlled exterior. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Katie said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Over the past weeks, she'd come to respect this huge, quiet man. Maybe it wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something. Trust, perhaps. Partnership. Jack stood and offered her his hand. Katie took it, letting him pull her to her feet. His hand engulfed hers, warm and calloused from years of hard work. That night, Katie moved her things into the master bedroom. The next morning, she woke to find Jack already gone, up before dawn as always. But there was a note on the pillow beside her, written in his careful, blocky handwriting. "Thank you for trusting me. Take the day for yourself." Katie did take the day mostly, though she still helped Carlos with lunch and spent time in the garden. But there was a lightness in her chest that hadn't been there before, a sense of belonging that went beyond just living in the house. The seasons changed. Fall turned to winter, and Katie learned what it meant to live on a working ranch. She helped Carlos preserve food for the cold months. She watched Jack and his men drive the cattle to lower pastures. She spent long evenings by the fire, reading while Jack worked on his ledgers. And when spring came, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and new grass, Katie discovered she was pregnant. She told Jack at breakfast, unable to keep the news to herself for even an hour. He stood so quickly his chair fell backward, then swept her up in his arms with a whoop of joy that brought Carlos running from the kitchen. "A son," Jack said, setting her down gently, his hands protective on her shoulders. "It's going to be a son, I know it. It might be a daughter," Katie reminded him, but she was smiling. "Then she'll be the smartest, strongest daughter in the territory," Jack declared. The pregnancy was difficult. Katie's body, weakened by years of poor food and hard living, struggled with the changes. The doctor from town, a gruff man named Peters, visited regularly and put her on strict bed rest for the last 2 months. Jack hovered like a nervous bear, constantly checking on her, bringing her books, adjusting her pillows until she finally shooed him away with affectionate exasperation. The baby came on a hot July night after 12 hours of labor that left Katie exhausted and wondering if she'd survive. But when the doctor finally placed the squirming, crying infant in her arms, all the pain faded away. "A boy," Dr. Peters announced. "Healthy lungs on this one." Jack stood at the bedside, staring down at his son with an expression Katie had never seen before. His eyes were wet, his jaw tight with emotion. "We did it," Katie whispered. "Down 4 to go." Jack laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Rest first. There's time." They named him William, after Jack's father, William Morrison, first of the new generation. But Katie's recovery took months. Her body had given everything it had to bring William into the world, and there wasn't much left. The doctor told them privately that another pregnancy too soon might kill her. Jack made a decision without consulting Katie, moving back to the room next door. When she confronted him about it, he was immovable. "I won't risk you," he said firmly. "William needs his mother. I need you. 5 sons aren't worth your life." "That was the agreement," Katie protested. "The agreement changed the moment I realized I love you," Jack said, the words coming out rough and honest. "It probably changed a lot sooner than that, but I'm too stubborn to have noticed. I want more children, yes, but not at the cost of losing you." Katie stared at him, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "You love me?" "Have for months," Jack admitted. "Didn't seem important to mention until now." "You're impossible," Katie said, but she was crying and smiling at the same time. "I love you too, you stubborn man. And we're having more children. Just not right this minute." 3 years passed before their second child arrived, another boy they named Henry. This pregnancy was easier, with Katie stronger and healthier than she'd been in years. The ranch was prospering, and so were they. 2 years after Henry came George, and then 3 years later, twin boys that Jack insisted on naming Peter and Paul after the apostles. Katie was too exhausted from birthing twins to argue. 5 sons as promised, though it had taken 12 years instead of the few Jack had probably imagined. William was 11 now, already learning to work cattle with his father. Henry, 8, preferred the horses and spent hours in the stables. George, at 5, followed Carlos everywhere, learning to cook. The twins, barely 2, were terrors who kept Katie constantly busy. The house that had once felt so empty was now full of noise and life. Toys littered the parlor. Muddy boots cluttered the entry. The dinner table was never quiet, filled with the boys' chatter and arguments and laughter. Katie often thought about that night in the saloon, when a giant stranger had offered her an impossible deal. She'd been so young, so desperate, so certain that nothing good could come from such a strange arrangement. She'd been spectacularly wrong. One evening, with the twins finally asleep and the older boys helping Jack with evening chores, Katie stood in the kitchen with Carlos, preparing supper. "You know," Carlos said, peeling potatoes with practiced ease, "when the boss first told me he was bringing home a wife, I thought he'd lost his mind." "Only thought?" Katie teased. "Well, I knew he'd lost his mind. But I figured I'd reserve judgment on whether it was the good kind of crazy or the bad kind." Carlos smiled at her. Turned out to be the best decision that stubborn fool ever made. Even with 5 boys tearing the place apart. Especially with 5 boys tearing the place apart. This house needed exactly what you brought to it. Life, warmth, love. All the things Jack built with his hands but couldn't create on his own. The door opened, and William burst in, followed by his brothers. They were filthy, covered in dust and dirt from whatever adventure they'd been on. "Ma, we're starving," William announced dramatically. "You're always starving," Katie said, but she was already moving to feed them. "Wash up first?" "All of you." Jack came in last, ducking through the doorway. At 54, he had more gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes, but he was still the same enormous man who'd walked into that saloon so many years ago. He caught Katie's eye across the room and smiled, that same small smile he'd given her over breakfast the morning after their wedding, a smile that said he knew exactly how lucky they both were. Later, when the boys were in bed and the house was finally quiet, Katie and Jack sat on the porch together, watching the stars. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Do you ever regret it?" Jack asked quietly. "Agreeing to marry a stranger?" Katie thought about the girl she'd been, barefoot and desperate, slinging drinks in a saloon. Then she thought about the woman she'd become, strong and healthy, surrounded by family and love. "Not even once," she said honestly. "Best decision I ever made, even though it took 12 years to give me 5 sons. Especially because it took 12 years, Katie said. "We got to build something real in that time. Not just a family, but a partnership. A life." Jack pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You gave me everything I asked for and things I didn't even know I needed." "You gave me the same," Katie whispered. They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, the house at their backs full of sleeping children, the ranch spreading out before them in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new moments of chaos and joy. But tonight, Katie Morrison sat with her husband under the stars, her bare feet long forgotten, her old life a distant memory, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The Barefoot Waitress had found her home, and the giant cowboy had found his family, and together they'd built something that would last for generations to come.